I came back from a grueling business trip to find a demolition crew tearing up the front yard of a $6 million Buckhead mansion. My own father had secretly sold the property for cash just to fund my younger brother's luxurious European vacation. When I eventually confronted him about his actions, he smirked at me and said the mansion paid for the whole family to have fun. I did not scream or cry or throw a tantrum, I just smiled back at him. He shouted at me, demanding to know why I was so calm after losing everything I supposedly worked for. I simply replied, because the mansion you sold actually belonged to the federal government. My name is Nia. I am 32 years old, and I am somehow still healing from the deep emotional wounds my family inflicted upon me over the years. I escaped their toxicity long ago, but I maintained occasional contact, a decision that proved to be my absolute biggest mistake. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who underestimated your worth and tried to destroy your life out of pure greed and jealousy. Growing up in the affluent African American community of Atlanta, image was everything. My father, Calvin, was a self-proclaimed pastor who cared more about the collection plate and his tailored suits than any actual spiritual guidance. My mother, Beatrice, was a master manipulator who used the concept of family loyalty as a weapon to control everyone around her. But the true center of their universe was my younger brother, DeAndre. He was the golden child, a 29-year-old illusionist who spent his days posting rented luxury cars and fake designer clothes on social media, pretending to be a highly successful entrepreneur while constantly drowning in massive debt. His fiancée, Chloe, was exactly like him, a social climber who whispered toxic ideas into his ear and fueled his worst financial habits. They all viewed me as the family disappointment. Because I wore plain clothes, drove a sensible car, and kept my finances completely private, they assumed I was struggling. They genuinely believed I was nothing more than a glorified maid or a lowly house sitter who barely made minimum wage cleaning up after wealthy people. The reality was vastly different, and that reality came crashing down on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon in Atlanta. I had just spent 2 exhausting weeks out of state managing a highly sensitive operation, and I was looking forward to returning to the quiet sanctuary of the Buckhead estate I was currently managing. The property was a sprawling $6 million architectural masterpiece, complete with towering wrought iron gates, lush manicured gardens, and a breathtaking custom Italian marble fountain in the center of the circular driveway. It was supposed to be empty and highly secure. As my sleek black SUV rolled up to the entrance, a heavy knot of dread instantly formed in the pit of my stomach. The state-of-the-art security keypad, a highly encrypted system that I had personally programmed and tested, was completely destroyed. The metal casing was smashed to pieces, and colored wires hung loosely from the stone pillar like the exposed veins of a wounded animal. The heavy iron gates had been forced wide open, completely compromising the perimeter of the estate. I parked my vehicle on the quiet street, stepping out into the suffocating Georgia heat. The sharp clicking of my heels against the pavement was entirely drowned out by the deafening roar of heavy machinery. The scene unfolding on the pristine front lawn was a vision of absolute chaos. A massive demolition crew had invaded the property. A burly contractor wearing a neon yellow safety vest was aggressively shouting orders over the loud rumble of a yellow backhoe. I watched in pure disbelief as the mechanical arm of the machine swung violently, smashing directly into the intricate tiers of the custom Italian marble fountain. Chunks of priceless white stone shattered and flew through the air, crashing onto the perfectly manicured grass while dust clouded the bright afternoon sky. I marched straight up to the contractor, my voice cutting through the noise as I demanded to know exactly what was going on and who had authorized this illegal destruction of private property. Before the confused contractor could even formulate a response, the heavy oak front door of the mansion swung open. A man stepped out onto the grand marble portico, and my eyes immediately narrowed. He was wearing a flashy, tailored suit that screamed of illicit new money and terrible taste. He casually struck a match against the stone railing, slowly lighting a thick cigar. He looked down at me with an expression of sheer arrogant amusement, clearly viewing me as a minor annoyance rather than a threat. He sauntered down the wide marble steps, chuckling darkly to himself as he approached me. "Listen here, sweetheart," he said, puffing a thick cloud of gray, acrid smoke directly into my face. "You must be the cleaning lady who got left behind when the owners cleared out. Your daddy Calvin sold this place to me for $1.5 million in cold, hard cash last week. So you need to kick rocks and get off my lawn before I call the cops and have you arrested for trespassing on my private property." My mind raced, processing his words with cold precision. My father had sold a $6 million estate for a fraction of its worth to a man carrying bags of untraceable cash. The man in the flashy suit reached inside his tailored jacket and pulled out a folded piece of thick paper. He tossed it carelessly toward me, letting it flutter through the dusty air and land right at my feet on the concrete driveway. I did not scream at him. I did not cry. I did not give him the satisfaction of seeing me lose my composure or break down into a hysterical panic. My training kicked in immediately. I maintained a perfectly neutral expression as I calmly bent over and picked up the crumpled document. It was a formal deed transfer. As my eyes rapidly scanned the dense legal text on the pages, the sheer audacity and scale of the betrayal became glaringly obvious. Right there on the signature line was my father's distinct handwriting. Calvin had boldly claimed ownership and illegally transferred the massive estate to this stranger. But what truly solidified the criminal conspiracy was the seal stamped directly next to my father's forged signature. It was the official state notary stamp belonging to my Uncle Tyrone, a man who had always operated in the shadowy gray areas of the law. They had conspired together to forge legal property documents. The man in the flashy suit stood there grinning around his cigar, fully expecting me to beg for my job or run away in tears. What he did not know, and what my ignorant, greedy family had failed to understand for all these years, was the reality of my actual profession. I am not a maid. I am not a house sitter. I am a highly trained forensic asset liquidator. I am directly contracted by the United States Marshals Service. My daily job involves inventorying, managing, securing, and eventually liquidating high-value properties, luxury vehicles and assets seized from federal criminals, cartel bosses, and money launderers. The $6 million mansion that my father had just fraudulently sold to a shady cash buyer was not mine to lose. It was a restricted federal asset that had recently been seized by the Drug Enforcement Administration. I smoothly folded the forged deed and slid it neatly into my designer handbag, securing the physical evidence of their massive federal crime. Without uttering a single word to the arrogant man blowing smoke in my direction, I turned around and walked back down the long driveway toward my car. My posture was perfectly straight, my steps unhurried and deliberate. Once I was safely enclosed inside the quiet, soundproof sanctuary of my vehicle, I pulled out my secure phone. I took a deep breath to steady my racing heart and dialed my father's number. The phone rang 3 times before the line connected. Instantly, a wave of loud, distinct background noise flooded through the speaker. I could hear the sharp clinking of fine crystal glasses, the low, steady murmur of affluent conversations, and the smooth, live jazz music that only played at Chop's Lobster Bar, the absolute most exclusive and expensive steakhouse in all of Atlanta. My family was out celebrating their massive payday. "Nia," my father answered, his voice dripping with an arrogant, self-satisfied authority that immediately made my skin crawl. "What do you want right now? We are in the middle of a very important family celebration, and I do not have time for your negativity." I gripped the leather steering wheel tightly, letting the sheer absurdity of his confidence wash over me. He was sitting in a 5-star restaurant drinking outrageously expensive champagne, celebrating the fact that he had just stolen and sold a house that did not belong to him. He thought he had outsmarted me and secured a lavish European vacation and a luxurious lifestyle for his golden child son DeAndre entirely at my expense. He had no idea that he had just stepped directly into a federal trap that would completely destroy his life. I kept my voice perfectly level, completely devoid of any anger or panic. "I just wanted to see how you were doing today, Dad," I said calmly. "Enjoy your expensive dinner." "Enjoy." I hung up the phone before he could respond, cutting off whatever hypocritical lecture he was about to deliver. I sat in my car for a long moment, staring up at the grand mansion through my windshield. My father, my mother, and my brother had just committed massive federal crimes. They had forged government documents, committed severe title fraud against the United States government, and accepted illicit cash from a man who was clearly involved in organized crime. They thought they had finally put me in my place. They thought they had won. I started my engine, a cold, calculating resolve settling over my entire body like armor. I was not going to warn them. I was going to let them spend that dirty money, letting them dig their own federal graves dollar by stolen dollar. The sheer arrogance of their actions was almost breathtaking, a testament to years of unchecked entitlement and blind greed. They had mistaken my quiet professionalism for weakness, assuming I would simply roll over and accept their blatant thievery as I had accepted their emotional abuse during my childhood. But the rules of engagement had drastically changed. I slowly pulled my vehicle away from the curb, leaving the loud destruction of the marble fountain behind me. I merged into the busy Atlanta traffic, my mind already meticulously mapping out the precise sequence of legal and financial maneuvers required to pull the net completely closed around them. The beautiful trap was officially set, and all I had to do was watch them gleefully lock themselves inside. I left the chaotic demolition site behind and drove straight toward the heart of Buckhead. I knew exactly where they would be. My father was a creature of habit, and his habits were exclusively funded by greed. I pulled my black SUV up to the valet stand outside Chop's Lobster Bar, the most exclusive and overpriced steakhouse in the entire city of Atlanta. The heavy humidity of the Georgia evening clung to the air, but my mind was completely icy and sharp. I handed over my keys to the attendant, adjusted the lapels of my tailored blazer, and walked confidently through the heavy double-glass doors of the restaurant. The ambient noise of wealthy patrons, the clinking of fine silverware, and the soft rhythm of live jazz music washed over me. I ignored the hostess standing at the front podium. I did not need her to guide me. I knew that Calvin would demand nothing less than the private dining room in the back. It was a secluded space reserved for politicians, elite athletes, and men like my father who needed thick mahogany doors to shield their profound hypocrisy from the general public. I reached the back hallway and pushed open the heavy double doors without bothering to knock. The scene that unfolded before my eyes was a grotesque theatrical display of unearned gluttony and arrogant celebration. The long, polished oak table literally groaned under the sheer weight of their feast. 3 massive iced seafood towers dominated the center of the table, stacked impossibly high with fresh lobster tails, Alaskan king crab legs, and jumbo shrimp. Thick, sizzling tomahawk steaks rested on pristine porcelain plates completely untouched as my family raised their glasses in a joyous toast. Empty bottles of Dom Perignon, easily costing $500 each, cluttered the edges of the table like discarded trophies. At the head of the table sat my father Calvin. He was a 58-year-old self-proclaimed mega-church pastor who weaponized religion for his own financial gain. He wore a brand-new custom-tailored suit, and a thick diamond pinky ring flashed aggressively under the warm glow of the crystal chandelier as he held his champagne flute high. Beside him sat my mother Beatrice. She was 55 years old and currently draped in a completely new, heavy set of oversized South Sea pearls. Her face was flushed with the intoxicating thrill of spending stolen money. Across the table from them sat my younger brother DeAndre, the undeniable golden child of the family, and his fiancée Chloe. DeAndre wore a vibrant designer silk shirt that screamed of illicit new money, while Chloe practically blinded everyone in the room with a massive sparkling new diamond engagement ring that she kept waving around emphatically as she spoke. They were mid-toast, laughing loudly, celebrating the absolute destruction of my supposed life. I walked straight up to the edge of the table. The lively conversation died instantly as my shadow fell directly over Calvin's expensive plate. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not utter a single word of greeting. I simply reached into my structured handbag, pulled out the photocopied deed transfer I had retrieved from the contractor, and slammed it down directly onto the center of the table. I threw the paper with such deliberate force that it clipped the base of Calvin's expensive champagne flute. The delicate crystal glass tipped over instantly and shattered against the solid mahogany wood. Expensive vintage champagne spilled rapidly over the edge of the table, soaking into his perfectly pressed suit trousers. The soft jazz music playing from the room's private speakers suddenly seemed to fade into a deafening silence. The shock in the room was absolute. Calvin did not jump out of his seat. He did not look guilty, remorseful, or even slightly embarrassed. He simply reached for his white linen napkin, slowly and methodically wiped his mouth, and looked up at me with an expression of mild, condescending annoyance. "Do not make a scene, Nia," he said, his voice dropping into that deep, resonant pastoral tone he specifically used to command obedience from his congregation. "It is unchristian behavior." I stared down at him, letting the sheer audacity of his words sink into the quiet room. "You forged my signature and sold a $6 million house," I said, keeping my voice dangerously low, entirely steady, and completely devoid of the hysterical emotion they were clearly expecting. "You took untraceable cash from a stranger, and you sit here in a private dining room telling me about what is Christian." Before Calvin could formulate another hypocritical response, my mother jumped into the conversation to defend her husband and her favorite son. Beatrice leaned forward, resting her newly acquired pearls against the edge of the table. She instantly deployed her classic manipulative tone, the specific cadence designed to make me feel small, selfish, and entirely unreasonable. "You are a single woman, Nia," she said, gesturing dismissively with her freshly manicured hand. "What on earth do you need 6 bedrooms for? You live alone, you work all the time, your brother is starting a family. Chloe deserves a proper wedding in Lake Como, Italy, and a 3-month European tour. God tells us to share our blessings with those who need them most. We simply reallocated the family resources to where they could do the most good." Reallocated the family resources. The phrase echoed in my head, a perfect summary of their toxic mindset. They honestly and truly believed that because we shared blood, any asset I possessed was automatically theirs to distribute as they saw fit. They viewed my supposed wealth not as the result of my own hard work, but as a communal slush fund that Calvin had the divine, unquestionable right to govern. Beatrice looked at me with an expression of feigned disappointment, treating my anger over massive real estate fraud as just another character flaw she had to patiently endure. "You should be happy for your brother," she continued casually, pouring herself another glass of expensive champagne, despite the tension in the room. "This is a joyous occasion. DeAndre is stepping into his role as a husband and a leader. He needs the proper foundation to start his new life. A foundation built entirely on a felony," I thought to myself, analyzing her words not as a daughter, but as an investigator collecting verbal confessions. DeAndre smirked, leaning far back in his plush leather dining chair. He did not look the least bit apologetic for stealing what he assumed was his sister's entire net worth. In fact, he looked incredibly proud of his own cleverness. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his drink and let out a highly satisfied sigh. "The deal is done, Nia," he bragged, swirling the amber liquor in his glass with a smug sense of finality. 1.5 million cash from the quick sale. It has already been wired directly to our offshore and domestic accounts. You cannot reverse it. The buyer has the deed, and we have the funds securely locked away. It is a win for everybody except maybe you, but you will figure it out." I looked at my brother, this 29-year-old man who had never held a real job for more than 6 months at a time, proudly boasting about liquidating what he thought was my life savings. He felt entirely justified in his actions, because our parents had spent his entire life conditioning him to believe that he was entitled to everything I earned. "And you, Dad," I said, shifting my cold gaze back to the head of the table where the patriarch of this criminal enterprise sat. "You orchestrated this entire fraudulent scheme just to pay for a vacation and a wedding." Calvin adjusted his tailored cuffs, looking incredibly self-righteous and completely untouched by any sense of moral conflict. "I kept $500,000 for my retirement ministry," he justified, his voice thick with unearned authority and false piety. "A pastor needs a proper safety net to continue doing the Lord's work without the stress of financial burdens. I gave the rest of the money to DeAndre to build the family legacy. You have your little cleaning business, Nia. You will bounce back from this minor setback. You always do. You are strong, but your brother needs a head start in this world. Every word they spoke was an absolute gift to a federal prosecutor. My mind automatically began categorizing their statements into specific charges. DeAndre admitting to receiving wired funds was wire fraud and money laundering. Calvin claiming he kept $500,000 for his ministry was tax evasion and the misappropriation of illicit funds. Beatrice acting as an accessory before and after the fact demonstrated a clear criminal conspiracy. They were handing me the exact evidence required to dismantle their lives completely. I looked at the luxurious spread of food rapidly cooling on the table, the butter congealing on the expensive seafood, the ice melting beneath the crab legs. It was a perfect metaphor for their situation. A lavish, expensive facade that was already beginning to rot from the inside out. I did not raise my voice. I did not flip the table or demand my supposed money back. I simply committed every detail of their arrogant celebration to memory. I memorized the brand of the champagne, the size of Chloe's new diamond, the specific cut of Calvin's suit. Every single item in this room purchased with that cash would be seized. Every bank account DeAndre proudly bragged about would be frozen by the federal government. They were currently enjoying the most expensive Last Supper of their lives, and my only job in that precise moment was to let them continue eating. Chloe broke the brief, heavy silence that had settled over the private dining room. She shifted in her seat, the expensive, heavy silk of her designer dress rustling loudly against the leather chair. She reached out and purposefully placed her hand over DeAndre's, angling her fingers with deliberate precision so the massive, newly purchased diamond engagement ring caught the warm light from the crystal chandelier overhead. She looked me up and down, her gaze dragging slowly from my practical flats to my understated tailored blazer. Her lips curled into a sneer of pure, unfiltered disdain. "Let us be entirely honest here, Nia," Chloe said, her voice dripping with that fake, sugary sweetness she always utilized when she was about to deliver a profound and calculated insult. "We all know you did not buy a $6 million estate in Buckhead with a legitimate job. You clean houses. You manage empty properties for rich people who actually work for a living. So how exactly did a glorified maid get her name on a deed to a mansion in the most exclusive zip code in Atlanta?" She did not wait for me to formulate an answer. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the fine linen tablecloth, her long acrylic nails tapping a sharp, irritating rhythm against the base of her wine glass. "You probably scammed some rich, lonely old man for it. Or maybe you played the sympathy card and manipulated someone who did not know any better. Either way, that house was never truly yours by any honest, hard-working means. We are just taking it back for the family. Think of it as reparations for all the times DeAndre had to watch you act like you were somehow superior to the rest of us." Beatrice nodded along in immediate, vigorous agreement. My mother had always despised the fact that she could never fully control me, and she eagerly latched onto Chloe's fabricated, malicious narrative. Beatrice reached up to touch her new, oversized pearls, adjusting them proudly so they sat perfectly against her collarbone. "Chloe is absolutely right," Beatrice chimed in, her tone shifting seamlessly into that of a deeply concerned, pitying matriarch. "We have all been very worried about the path you have chosen, Nia. You are 32 years old. You have no husband. You have no children. You have no real prospects for building a family of your own. What kind of legacy are you leaving behind?" "A collection of mops and brooms," she sighed heavily, casting a loving, adoring glance toward DeAndre, who was busy chewing on a piece of premium steak. "Your brother is stepping up to fulfill his biological and spiritual duties. He is providing this family with a future. He is giving us grandchildren. He is marrying a wonderful woman who understands the value of family unity and shared wealth. You, on the other hand, have failed in every metric that matters for a woman of your age. Keeping a massive empty house to yourself while your own brother struggles to fund his wedding is not just utterly selfish. It is a glaring symptom of your deep, unresolved bitterness." Calvin, never one to miss a golden opportunity to weaponize his religious authority, folded his hands together on the table, resting his chin on his knuckles. He looked at me with an expression of profound disappointment, perfectly playing the role of the benevolent pastor, forced to discipline a wayward, rebellious member of his flock. "The Lord provides for those who walk the righteous path," Calvin proclaimed, his voice echoing slightly in the perfect acoustics of the private room. When I saw that deed, I knew it was a direct sign from above. God does not grant a $6 million fortress to a solitary, stubborn woman who refuses to submit to the natural order of things. That property was a misplaced blessing. And as the spiritual head of this family, it was my divine responsibility to correct that glaring error. I took that asset and converted it into a solid foundation for DeAndre's marriage. A man needs substantial capital to lead his household, Nia. A woman simply needs to learn submission and grace. Two things you have severely lacked since you were a difficult teenager. I stood there listening to this synchronized, perfectly harmonized chorus of psychological abuse. For years, these exact types of coordinated attacks had successfully broken me down. They used to make me question my own sanity, my own worth, and my own reality. They possessed a terrifying ability to twist their toxic greed into acts of familial love and religious duty. But standing in that private dining room today, looking at the four of them congratulating themselves on their perceived victory over me, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical, and highly professional detachment. Instead of defending my honor, crying, or screaming about the injustice of it all, my analytical mind effortlessly took over. I stopped seeing my family and started seeing a detailed, itemized ledger of stolen federal funds. My eyes locked onto Chloe's hand. The center stone was a flawless, radiant cut, at least 4 carats flanked by tapered baguettes. Estimated retail value $45,000. The platinum setting gleamed unnaturally bright. Given DeAndre's usual lack of financial acumen, he likely bought it in the Atlanta Diamond District in pure cash to avoid a paper trail, completely unaware that cash purchases over $10,000 mandate a Form 8300 filing with the Internal Revenue Service, a filing he definitely did not complete. I shifted my gaze to Calvin. Peeking out from beneath the tailored cuff of his new Italian wool suit was a heavy, solid gold timepiece. A Rolex Day-Date Presidential, estimated retail value $38,000. He had traded his usual modest leather-strapped watch for a glaring ticking beacon of federal tax evasion. Then I looked at Beatrice. The South Sea pearls around her neck were perfectly spherical, flawlessly matched in size and luster, an incredibly rare strand that easily cost upwards of $20,000. And DeAndre, sitting there with his smug, self-satisfied grin, was wearing a limited edition Audemars Piguet that cost more than most people earn in an entire year. They had collectively spent well over $150,000 in the span of a few days, leaving a massive glaring trail of forensic evidence that any first-year financial investigator could follow blindfolded. They were so blinded by their sudden greed, so utterly intoxicated by their influx of illicit wealth, that they genuinely believed they were completely untouchable. "Are you even listening to us?" Nia Chloe snapped clearly, irritated that I had not burst into tears or launched into a screaming defense of my character. "You are just standing there staring like a total freak. Accept that you lost and leave. You are ruining our celebration energy with your bad vibes." I slowly blinked, bringing my sharp focus back to Chloe's hostile face. The rage that had initially flared in my chest when I saw the demolished fountain at the estate had completely evaporated, replaced by an absolute terrifying calm. I did not need to scream. I did not need to justify my highly specialized career, my relationship status, or my intrinsic value as a human being to a group of people who were actively and gleefully speeding toward a massive federal indictment. I let out a slow, steady breath. The corners of my mouth began to turn upward. I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was not a smile of surrender, acceptance, or defeat. It was a chilling, dead-eyed, predatory smile. It was the exact smile a hunter gives when the prey finally walks willingly into the absolute center of the snare and the heavy steel doors lock shut behind them. Calvin shifted uncomfortably in his plush leather seat, his pastoral confidence wavering for a fraction of a second as he registered the pure, unadulterated ice in my expression. He opened his mouth to deliver another sermon, another tired manipulation designed to put me back in my place. But I did not give him the chance to speak. I smoothly picked up my structured designer handbag from the edge of the table. I adjusted the strap on my shoulder with practiced, effortless elegance. I looked directly into DeAndre's eyes, holding his arrogant gaze until his smug smirk finally began to falter under the immense weight of my absolute silence. "Enjoy Italy." "DeAndre," I said, my voice smooth, melodic, and completely devoid of any anger or sorrow. "Make sure you take a lot of pictures." I turned my back on the four of them and walked purposefully toward the heavy mahogany double doors. I did not look back as I pushed them open and stepped out into the bustling, brightly lit hallway of the steakhouse. I left them sitting there, surrounded by their expensive champagne and stolen seafood, completely oblivious to the fact that their luxurious European vacation was about to become the most thoroughly documented piece of evidence in a sweeping federal racketeering case. The drive from Chop's Lobster Bar to my actual home took less than 15 minutes, but the transition in atmosphere was absolute. My family believed I lived in a cramped, budget-friendly apartment complex on the outskirts of the city, barely scraping by on a cleaner's salary. In reality, I pulled my SUV into the private, subterranean garage of a hyper-secure glass high-rise in the absolute center of Midtown Atlanta. The biometric scanner read my fingerprint and retina before the reinforced steel elevator doors parted, granting me direct access to my top-floor penthouse. I stepped inside, letting the heavy door seal shut, with a pressurized hiss behind me. The space was a massive, minimalist expanse of polished concrete floors, dark steel accents, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered an uninterrupted panoramic view of the glittering Atlanta skyline. There were no family photos on the walls. There were no sentimental trinkets. Every single inch of this space was designed for high-level security and absolute digital dominance. I walked straight past the custom kitchen and entered my command center. This was not a standard home office. It was a forensic laboratory. 3 massive curved monitors dominated the sleek glass desk, powered by custom-built liquid-cooled servers, processing encrypted data on secure federal networks. I set my handbag down, removed my blazer, and cracked my knuckles. It was time to go to work. I booted up the primary workstation, entering my dual-factor authentication credentials to bypass the strict federal firewall. Once inside my secure terminal, I accessed the hidden cloud-based security surveillance network I had personally installed throughout the Buckhead mansion. My family thought I was just an uneducated girl managing the property, completely unaware that federal asset liquidators do not leave $6 million seized estates unguarded. I had placed micro cameras in the crown-molding motion sensors behind the HVAC vents and high-definition audio recorders inside the decorative light fixtures. Every square inch of that property was monitored, recorded, and backed up to an encrypted offshore cloud server. I pulled up the timeline from exactly 2 weeks ago, scrubbing through the digital archives until I found the precise moment the perimeter had been breached. The timestamp glowed brightly on my monitor. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I clicked play and leaned back in my ergonomic chair, watching the ultimate betrayal unfold in crisp 4K resolution. The feed from the grand foyer loaded instantly. The heavy oak front doors pushed open and DeAndre stepped inside, looking nervously over his shoulder. Chloe followed close behind him, her eyes wide with greedy anticipation as she took in the soaring 30-foot ceilings and the sweeping double staircase. She ran her hands over the expensive imported wallpaper, already acting as if she owned the place. DeAndre looked hesitant, his natural cowardice battling with his unearned greed. He paced back and forth across the marble floor. "Are you sure about this, Chloe?" he asked, his voice captured perfectly by the hidden audio sensors. "Nia said this place is strictly off-limits. She is going to kill us if she finds out we came in here." Chloe rolled her eyes in exaggerated annoyance, flipping her long hair over her shoulder. She grabbed DeAndre by the collar of his shirt, pulling him close. "Do not be weak, DeAndre," she hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "Your sister is a glorified maid who thinks she is better than us. She does not own this place. She just has the keys. We are taking what your family deserves. Just find the deed, babe. Your dad said Uncle Tyrone can forge the rest. I hit pause, taking a slow, steady breath. There it was. The direct verbal confirmation of a criminal conspiracy to commit title fraud captured in crystal clear audio. Chloe had just firmly established herself as the driving instigator, manipulating my brother into a federal felony. I highlighted the timecode, extracted the clip, and dragged it into a new, heavily encrypted folder on my desktop labeled Federal Evidence. I resumed the playback, switching camera angles as the two of them moved through the massive estate. They treated the property like a shopping mall, opening closets, rummaging through expensive staging furniture, and tossing items aside carelessly. They finally made their way into the primary master suite, where I had temporarily set up a small workstation during my inventory process. They began tearing through the desk drawers, tossing confidential property assessment forms and inventory logs onto the floor. I watched Chloe snatch a solid gold pen from the desk and slip it right into her designer purse, casually committing theft as a warm-up to her grand real estate heist. But the footage of DeAndre and Chloe was only the beginning of the nightmare. I fast-forwarded the timeline by 3 hours. The security system flagged a new entry at the front gate. This time it was my parents. Calvin and Beatrice strolled through the front doors of the mansion like conquering royalty. Beatrice was actually holding a measuring tape, pointing at the custom drapery and loudly discussing how she would redecorate the grand salon once the sale went through. I switched the feed to the master suite office where DeAndre and Chloe had been searching earlier. Calvin marched straight into the room, shoving DeAndre out of the way. "You two are moving too slow," Calvin barked, his pastoral voice, replaced by the sharp, greedy tone of a common thief. "We have a cash buyer lined up and waiting. Tyrone needs a clean signature sample and some kind of official authorization document by tonight." Beatrice stood in the doorway laughing as she watched her husband and son completely ransack my workspace. She picked up a framed photograph I had left on a side table, a picture of myself receiving an award from the Marshal's Service. She scoffed, tossing the frame face down into a wastebasket. "Look at her playing important," Beatrice said with a harsh, mocking laugh. "She is our child Calvin. Everything she has is ours anyway." I zoomed in on Calvin. He was forcefully prying open a locked filing cabinet with a flathead screwdriver he had brought from his car. He yanked the metal drawer open and began aggressively pulling out thick stacks of manila folders. These were my personal files documents I had stored there temporarily during my transition between assignments. He threw my birth certificate, my tax returns, and my college transcripts onto the floor like trash. Suddenly, Calvin stopped. He pulled a thick blue folder from the back of the drawer. A massive grin spread across his face. He held the document up to the light, tapping the thick paper triumphantly. "Well, well, well," Calvin chuckled, turning to show Beatrice and the kids. "The Lord truly provides." He held up an old notarized medical power of attorney. It was a document I had drafted 5 years ago when I underwent an emergency appendectomy. At the time, I had stupidly listed Calvin as my emergency contact and granted him temporary power of attorney for my medical decisions in case I was incapacitated. The document had expired years ago and held absolutely zero legal weight for real estate transactions. But to a crooked notary like Uncle Tyrone, it was exactly the template he needed. "This is all Tyrone needs," Calvin said on the tape, his eyes gleaming with malicious excitement. "He can use this old notary stamp to replicate the seal and lift her exact signature for the transfer deed. We are going to be rich by Friday." I sat in the cold, blue light of my monitor screens, my heart beating with a steady mechanical rhythm. There was no sadness left in my chest. The last lingering fragments of familial loyalty, any tiny shred of hope that my parents might actually possess a basic moral compass, were entirely eradicated by the visual evidence playing out before me. They were not just opportunists making a split-second bad decision. They were calculated, methodical predators who laughed while violating my privacy and stealing what they believed was my entire livelihood. I switched into complete operational mode. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard with practiced speed. I downloaded every single frame of the security footage. I extracted every audio clip running the sound files through a specialized federal vocal enhancement software to ensure that every whispered threat, every arrogant brag, and every admission of guilt was perfectly crisp and undeniably clear. I matched the timestamps from the video files directly to the banking transaction logs I had pulled from my investigative database. The digital dossier I was compiling was an absolute masterpiece of forensic evidence. I created separate, highly detailed subfolders for each member of my family. For DeAndre, I logged the exact moments he coordinated the physical break-in and the subsequent wire transfers that deposited the illicit cash into his accounts. For Chloe, I documented the verbal conspiracy and the physical theft of federal property from the desk. For Calvin, I highlighted the premeditated destruction of a locked container, the theft of personal identity documents, and the explicit verbalized intent to commit forgery. And for Beatrice, I logged her undeniable presence as a willing and enthusiastic accessory to a massive federal crime. But I was not finished. The most crucial piece of the puzzle was Uncle Tyrone. Using my secure access to the state notary database, I ran a comprehensive audit on Tyrone's official notary log. It took less than 10 minutes to find the fraudulent entry. He had backdated a log entry to make it appear as though I had willingly stood in his office and signed the deed transfer over to my father. Tyrone had officially weaponized his state commission seal to facilitate a federal felony. I ripped the digital copy of that log and dropped it directly into the dossier. I organized the files, encrypted the entire massive folder, and stamped it with the highest level of federal classification available to my clearance tier. I drafted a comprehensive executive summary detailing the precise statutes of the United States Penal Code they had violated. Title 18, Section 1343 for wire fraud. Title 18, Section 1001 for making false statements. Title 18, Section 471 for forgery of federal property documents. The trap was now officially, undeniably set. I leaned back in my chair and watched the progress bar hit 100% as the encrypted dossier synced securely to my backup servers. My family was currently packing their designer luggage for a European vacation funded entirely by marked illicit money, completely unaware that their every move was now part of a rapidly expanding federal racketeering case. They had asked for a family legacy, and I was going to ensure they received one. A legacy permanently recorded in the federal penitentiary system. I closed my laptop, the screen going black, and prepared for the next phase of their absolute destruction. 2 weeks later, the digital evidence of their massive European delusion began pouring into my secondary monitors. While I was clocking grueling high-stakes hours finalizing the asset forfeiture documentation, DeAndre and Chloe were living out an utterly fabricated billionaire lifestyle funded entirely by a cartel frontman. The sheer volume and absolute obnoxiousness of their daily social media updates were actually impressive from an evidentiary standpoint. They were not just taking a vacation, they were performing a hostile financial takeover of their own fragile egos. My automated scripts pulled their Instagram stories directly into the secure federal server the exact second they were posted. The footage started in Lake Como, Italy. DeAndre was standing on the polished teak deck of a classic rented Riva speedboat, dramatically popping the cork on a bottle of vintage champagne while wearing a bright, ostentatious silk shirt that fluttered in the wind. Chloe was draped across the white leather seats, adjusting her oversized designer sunglasses and holding up her left hand to make sure her new engagement ring caught the Italian sunlight. The caption on the video read, "Securing the legacy, #blessed, #generational wealth." Next came the absolute gluttony of Milan. The stories documented a frantic, uncontrolled shopping spree through the massive high-end flagship stores in the Galleria Vittorio Emanuele II. Chloe filmed DeAndre trying on incredibly expensive custom-tailored Italian suits, bragging loudly to the camera about how only the finest fabrics touch the skin of a true boss. The very next clip showed them sitting in the VIP lounge of the Gucci store, surrounded by a mountain of iconic green shopping bags sipping complimentary espresso while holding up thick wads of cash for the camera. The absolute pinnacle of their reckless spending spree occurred in Paris. DeAndre posted a highly produced, heavily filtered reel of them occupying a massive roped-off VIP section in one of the most exclusive nightclubs near the Champs-Élysées. They had ordered a parade of sparkler-lit bottles carried by waitresses in elaborate costumes. DeAndre was throwing cash onto the table, dancing wildly to the heavy bass, while Chloe filmed herself screaming over the music about how they had finally arrived at the top of the world. They were burning through illicit funds with a terrifying, unhinged velocity, completely unaware that every single swipe of their black card was an additional charge on a federal indictment. Back in Atlanta, the echo chamber of enablers was operating at full capacity. I monitored Beatrice's public Facebook page watching as my mother actively weaponized my brother's stolen vacation to elevate her own social standing within the megachurch community. She shared every single photo and video DeAndre posted, adding long, rambling, highly spiritualized captions about the power of prayer and the importance of family legacy. "Look at my handsome son and his beautiful future bride," Beatrice wrote in one particularly nauseating post, attaching a photo of them on a balcony overlooking the Amalfi Coast. "The Lord truly blesses those who walk the righteous path and honor their parents. DeAndre is building an empire for the next generation. Hashtag proud mother, hashtag blessed and highly favored." Her church congregation, completely ignorant of the fact that this empire was built on title fraud and cartel money, flooded the comment section with praises and hallelujahs. They congratulated her on raising such a successful, godly son. But inevitably, someone in the comments would ask the question she was desperately trying to avoid. One prominent church elder, a woman named Sister Martha, commented, "What a beautiful trip. I haven't seen Nia in the pictures. Is she not celebrating with her brother?" Beatrice's response was swift, calculated, and deeply malicious. She replied directly to Sister Martha, ensuring the entire congregation could see her passive-aggressive condemnation. "Nia is currently going through a very difficult, selfish phase," Beatrice typed, adding a sad face emoji for maximum manipulative effect. "She has chosen to distance herself from the family during this joyous season. We are simply giving her space to find her way back to the Lord. Please keep her hardened heart in your daily prayers." I read those words while sitting perfectly still in a sterile, heavily soundproofed boardroom on the 14th floor of the federal building in downtown Atlanta. The stark fluorescent lighting reflected off the polished mahogany table, a harsh contrast to the warm, glittering illusion my family was projecting across the Atlantic. I was not alone in the room. Sitting across from me were two seasoned federal agents, Special Agent Ramirez from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division and Deputy Marshal Vance, the lead operative coordinating the asset seizure on the Buckhead property. We were not praying for my heart. We were actively mapping the precise geographical trajectory of the wire transfers DeAndre was initiating across Europe. A massive high-resolution digital map dominated the screen at the end of the boardroom, plotting red dots every single time DeAndre or Chloe engaged in a financial transaction. "The sheer audacity of this kid is almost insulting," Agent Ramirez muttered, shaking his head as another red dot flashed on the screen, indicating a massive charge at a luxury hotel in Monaco. "He is using a standard domestic routing number to access funds that were initially deposited through a flagged high-risk LLC. He is leaving a forensic trail an absolute novice could follow." "Does he really think we cannot see this?" "He thinks he is a genius," I replied, my voice cool and entirely devoid of familial sentiment. I clicked a button on my laptop, pulling up the corresponding transaction data for the Monaco charge and pushing it to the main screen. $12,500 for a 3-night stay in a premium suite. He operates under the delusion that wealth automatically equates to intelligence. He assumes that because he has the money, the system will naturally protect him. Deputy Marshal Vance leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his eyes locked on the scrolling data. "He has burned through nearly $250,000 in 14 days, Vance noted, his tone flat and analytical. At this burn rate, he is going to exhaust the liquid portion of the funds before he even reaches his planned return date. We need to secure the remaining assets before he attempts to transfer them into untraceable offshore accounts, assuming he even knows how to do that. He does not, I assured them, typing a command to log the IP address of DeAndre's most recent login attempt. Chloe might try to convince him to move the money, but neither of them possesses the technical sophistication to bypass the standard banking protocols without triggering automatic federal alerts. They are operating on pure adrenaline and terrible advice. I was letting them spend the money. Every single swipe of the card, every ATM withdrawal, every luxury purchase was actively compounding the severity of the federal charges stacking up against them. I was not stopping them because stopping them now would only lead to minor fraud charges. I needed the financial threshold to cross the precise legal marker that triggers mandatory minimum sentencing under the federal sentencing guidelines. I wanted the full weight of the United States justice system to crash down upon them with an absolute unavoidable finality. My calculated silence was my most powerful weapon. If I had warned them, if I had yelled at Beatrice on Facebook or sent DeAndre an angry text message, they would have panicked. They might have attempted to hide the remaining funds or consulted a criminal defense attorney. By remaining completely silent, I was allowing their own bloated egos to construct the very cage that would eventually hold them. I watched the map light up again, a new red dot appearing in the south of France. A luxury car rental, a vintage Ferrari booked for 3 days. I tapped the screen, officially logging the transaction into the federal database. Enjoy the ride, DeAndre, I whispered quietly, in the sterile boardroom, knowing that the engine he was currently revving was driving him straight toward a 15-year sentence in a federal penitentiary. The illusion was almost complete, and the reality was waiting patiently for them to finally land back on American soil. While DeAndre and Chloe were creating a digital catalog of their federal crimes across Europe, the grand illusion of their payday began to fracture violently back home in Atlanta. The man who had arrogantly blown cigar smoke in my face was discovering the harsh reality of purchasing stolen federal assets. His name was Silas. He was a connected frontman for a local cartel, utilizing commercial acquisitions to launder illicit drug money through the booming housing market. He strode into the Atlanta Department of City Planning, expecting a simple approval process. He carried a leather briefcase containing the forged deed transfer blueprints for a modern compound and untraceable cash to grease-hesitant clerks. He approached the main counter, sliding the fraudulent paperwork toward a bored municipal employee. He demanded expedited demolition permits for the Buckhead estate, speaking with the tone of a man accustomed to immediate obedience. The clerk sighed, adjusted her glasses, and typed the property identification number into the central database. Silas tapped his heavy gold rings impatiently against the counter, his mind planning the demolition schedule. But the database did not pull up a standard residential zoning file. Instead, the clerk's monitor locked down. A solid red security banner flashed aggressively across the screen, accompanied by a sharp warning tone that cut through the low hum of the government office. The text read, "Restricted Federal Asset, United States Marshals Service. Seizure protocol active. Do not process." The clerk recoiled from the terminal, looking up at Silas with escalating alarm. She informed him, her voice trembling under his intense glare, that the city had no jurisdiction to issue permits for that address. She explained that the property was locked in a strict federal holding pattern, and local authorities were legally prohibited from altering the zoning status or ownership records of a seized asset. Silas snatched the forged deed off the counter, the confident smirk vanishing from his face. The realization hit his mind like a physical blow. He had not purchased a real estate investment. He had handed $1.5 million of his violent boss's scrutinized cartel cash directly to a small-time preacher for a property monitored by the federal government. He was holding a highly radioactive asset, and his superiors were not men who accepted polite apologies for missing funds. Silas jumped into his sports car and drove aggressively toward the affluent suburban neighborhoods where my father operated his highly profitable spiritual empire. Calvin's megachurch was a massive stadium-style complex, a towering monument to commercialized faith built on the tithes of thousands of unsuspecting congregants. The building featured towering glass windows and an extravagant pastoral wing. Calvin was sitting comfortably in his private office, oblivious to the impending disaster racing toward him. He was leaning back in his leather chair, admiring his reflection in the polished mahogany desk, rehearsing his upcoming Sunday sermon about the virtues of wealth and family loyalty. He felt completely untouchable, deeply insulated by the stolen cash sitting securely in his offshore accounts. That false sense of security was violently shattered when the double doors of his pastoral office were kicked open with explosive force. The wooden doors crashed against the drywall, splintering the expensive decorative trim. Silas marched into the room, his face twisted in a terrifying mask of absolute fury. He did not bother closing the doors behind him. He walked straight up to the mahogany desk, reaching aggressively inside his tailored jacket. Calvin froze completely, his eyes widening in sheer terror, assuming the angry man was drawing a weapon. Instead, Silas pulled out the rejected municipal permit applications and the forged deed transfer. He slammed them down onto the polished wood surface so hard that Calvin's framed theology degrees rattled against the wall. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the cavernous office space. "You sold me a restricted property, old man," Silas snarled, leaning across the desk until his face was inches from my father's terrified expression. He reached out and grabbed Calvin by the silk tie, hauling the supposed man of God halfway out of his luxurious chair. "You took $1.5 million of my money and handed me a worthless piece of paper for a house owned by the federal government. You sold me a DEA seizure." Calvin choked loudly, his hands instinctively grasping at Silas's wrist, desperately trying to loosen the suffocating grip on his throat. He attempted to deploy his smooth-talking pastoral charm, stammering out panicked excuses about simple administrative misunderstandings and minor filing errors. But Silas was an apex predator who easily recognized the pathetic thrashing of cornered prey. He twisted the silk tie even tighter, cutting off Calvin's air supply completely. "I do not care about your pathetic excuses," Silas whispered, his voice dropping to a lethal register that conveyed a deeply serious threat. "I am not some gullible member of your congregation you can fast talk out of a weekly donation. I represent dangerous people who will gladly skin you alive and mount your tailored suits in their living rooms. I want my $1.5 million back in cash by Friday, or I will return here with my crew and burn this massive church to the ground with you securely locked inside it." Silas shoved Calvin backward, sending the pastor crashing hard into his executive chair. Calvin gasped desperately for air, his chest heaving, his immaculate suit ruined and rumpled. He stared up at the cartel front man, his previous arrogance entirely evaporated, replaced quickly by the primal, paralyzing fear of a man who suddenly realized he was no longer the most powerful person in the room. Silas straightened his own jacket, gave Calvin one final look of absolute disgust, and walked out of the office, leaving the rejected permits resting on the desk like a signed death warrant. Calvin remained frozen in his chair for a long time, the terrifying reality of his situation crushing his chest. The cartel was demanding the immediate return of the money, but the funds were already gone, currently being rapidly drained by DeAndre and Chloe in European boutiques. Calvin had no way to access the cash, no way to stop the bleeding, and absolutely no way to satisfy the violent men he had foolishly defrauded. In his state of absolute panic, Calvin's mind grasped at the only logical lifeline he could possibly comprehend. He falsely assumed the zoning issue was merely a stubborn bureaucratic hurdle regarding the transfer of titles. He convinced himself that if he could just provide the buyer with the original authentic title documents bearing my legitimate signature, he could somehow force the city to process the permits. He desperately needed me. I was sitting comfortably in my secure penthouse, quietly monitoring the steady stream of European transaction alerts on my servers, when my encrypted phone began to ring. The caller identification displayed my father's name. I let it ring 3 times, savoring the moment, before I calmly pressed the answer button. I did not speak first. I let the heavy silence hang over the connection. "Nia, sweetie," Calvin said, his voice trembling slightly, completely stripped of the arrogant authority he had wielded during our confrontation at the steakhouse. "Daddy needs a massive favor. It is incredibly important." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the digital map of DeAndre's spending spree. I kept my tone light, pleasant, and utterly vacant, Oh, hi, Dad. I thought you were busy celebrating the family legacy. What can I do for you? He swallowed audibly over the phone, the sound of his poorly masked anxiety acting like music to my ears. There has been a slight administrative mix-up with the property transfer, he stammered, attempting to project a false sense of professional calm. The buyer is being difficult. He claims the municipal office needs to see the original title documents to verify the chain of custody. I know you were keeping the files organized. Can you just mail the original title documents directly to my office? I need them immediately. He was literally begging. Pastor Calvin, the man who had declared me a failure and stolen my supposed livelihood, was now desperate for my assistance to save his life from the cartel. I smiled a deeply satisfied smile and weaponized my silence. I let the pause stretch for 10 agonizing seconds, listening to his panicked breathing on the other end of the line. Oh, I do not know where they are, Dad, I replied, injecting my voice with naive confusion. You guys made a mess when you broke into my filing cabinets. You threw all my papers everywhere. I have not had time to organize the office since you reallocated the family resources. I will have to look for them, but my schedule is very packed right now. It might take a few weeks to sort through the damage you left behind. The drive from the federal building back to my penthouse was a blur of calculated anticipation. For years, I had quietly absorbed my family's insults, their condescension, and their blatant attempts to diminish my existence. I had built a highly specialized, incredibly demanding career out of pure grit, carefully masking my success to avoid their parasitic financial demands. They had viewed my silence as weakness. They had viewed my modest appearance as proof of my failure. They were about to learn that my silence was actually the meticulous patient observation of a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Back at my command center, my automated surveillance scripts continued to pull fresh data from DeAndre and Chloe's European tour. The final 48 hours of their trip were a frantic, unhinged display of desperate consumption. They were burning through the last remaining thousands of the illicit cartel cash, desperately trying to sustain the illusion of infinite wealth. DeAndre posted a heavily filtered video from a private chartered helicopter flying over the French Riviera. He was shouting over the loud thrum of the rotor blades, holding up a brand new diamond-encrusted designer watch to the camera. "We do not do commercial," DeAndre bragged loudly, his voice thick with unearned arrogance. "This is how the real bosses travel, building that generational wealth, one city at a time. The grind never stops." I scoffed at his profound stupidity. The only thing grinding was the federal indictment slowly grinding his entire future into dust. My tracking software immediately logged the helicopter charter company, tracing the payment back to the same flagged offshore account he had been draining for 2 weeks. He had spent nearly $50,000 in the last 2 days alone, completely exhausting the liquid funds Calvin had allocated for the trip. They were flying home entirely broke, returning to an empty bank account, assuming they could simply rely on the remaining funds Calvin had hidden away for his retirement ministry. They had absolutely no idea that every single account associated with their names, both domestic and foreign, had already been frozen by the United States Treasury Department pending the RICO investigation. Meanwhile, Beatrice was working frantically to set the stage for their triumphant return to Atlanta. My mother possessed a terrifying, almost pathological need for external validation. She could not simply welcome her golden child home in private. She needed an audience to witness her perceived triumph. She spent the entire day calling every single influential member of her mega-church congregation, the local politicians Calvin had aggressively courted over the years, and the affluent neighbors who lived in their gated suburban community. I monitored her activity through the shared family calendar app, which she had foolishly forgotten to lock me out of years ago. The schedule for the Welcome Home Gala was meticulously planned. A high-end catering company had been hired to serve premium Wagyu sliders and truffle macaroni. A local string quartet was booked to play in the grand foyer. Beatrice had even scheduled a professional photographer to document the event for the church's quarterly newsletter. She was turning a homecoming party into a coronation ceremony for the prince and princess of her fraudulent empire. I received a final frantic voicemail from Uncle Tyrone late that evening. He sounded completely broken, the slick confidence of the corrupted street notary entirely stripped away by the looming threat of federal prison. "Nia, please. Tyrone begged, his voice cracking with genuine terror. "You have to answer the phone. The state board just officially suspended my notary commission. They are auditing my entire logbook. Men in suits showed up at my office asking questions about the Buckhead transfer. I am begging you, Nia. I will double the money. I will give you 100 grand. Just say you signed the paper. You are going to ruin my life." I deleted the voicemail without a second thought. Tyrone had willingly chosen to participate in a criminal conspiracy that actively sought to rob his own niece. His impending destruction was entirely self-inflicted. I felt no pity for the man who had gladly sold my signature for a fraction of the cartel's cash. The next morning, the tension in the air was palpable. I spent the early hours coordinating the final logistics with Deputy Marshal Vance and Special Agent Ramirez. The tactical units were already quietly moving into position, establishing a covert perimeter around my parents' expansive suburban home. Undercover vehicles were parked strategically at the neighborhood entrances, and plainclothes agents were monitoring the catering crews and party rental trucks arriving at the property. The operation was designed to be swift, overwhelming, and utterly decisive. "We hit them tonight at exactly 8:30, Vance confirmed over the secure line, his voice sharp and professional. "The party will be at its absolute peak. The targets will be relaxed, distracted, and surrounded by their peers. We minimize the risk of armed resistance or destruction of evidence when they are actively performing for an audience. We want them completely off guard." I agreed with his assessment. The psychological impact of a public takedown was exactly what my family deserved. They had used their public image as a shield to hide their toxic, predatory behavior for decades. It was only fitting that their shiny, perfect facade was violently shattered in front of the very people they had worked so tirelessly to impress. As the afternoon shifted into evening, I began my own preparations. For years, I had deliberately attended family events wearing modest, unremarkable clothing. I had hidden my bespoke tailored suits, my expensive designer shoes, and my high-end jewelry to avoid their relentless, jealous interrogation. I had made myself small to make them feel large. Not tonight. I walked into my massive, custom-built walk-in closet and selected a stunning, razor-sharp designer suit in a deep, commanding shade of crimson. It was a garment that projected absolute, undeniable power and authority. I paired the suit with pristine black Christian Louboutin stilettos, the signature red soles perfectly matching the sharp lines of the jacket. I arranged my hair in a sleek, flawless style and applied my makeup with meticulous, cold precision. When I looked in the full-length mirror, I did not see the quiet, submissive daughter they had bullied and manipulated. I saw the highly lethal federal contractor who was about to systematically dismantle their entire existence. I picked up my structured leather briefcase containing the final printed copies of the federal indictment summaries and the forged deed. I took the private elevator down to the subterranean garage and bypassed my usual inconspicuous daily driver. Instead, I walked over to the sleek, custom matte black Porsche Panamera I rarely drove in public. The powerful engine roared to life with a deep, aggressive growl that perfectly matched my internal rhythm. I drove out into the warm Atlanta evening, navigating the busy highways toward the affluent suburbs where my parents lived. The sky was turning a brilliant shade of orange and purple as the sun began to set, casting long, dramatic shadows across the manicured lawns and towering oak trees of their gated community. The street leading to my parents' house was already lined with expensive luxury vehicles. Mercedes, BMWs, and Range Rovers belonging to the church elders and the local elite were packed tightly along the curb. The house itself was ablaze with warm, golden light. I could hear the soft, elegant strains of the string quartet drifting through the open front doors, mingling with the loud, joyful laughter of the assembled guests. Beatrice had truly outdone herself. She had constructed the perfect glittering stage for their ultimate downfall. I parked the Porsche directly behind a massive lifted SUV, ignoring the designated parking instructions posted by the neighborhood security. I did not care about a parking ticket. I stepped out of the vehicle, the sharp click of my stilettos echoing loudly on the concrete pavement. I smoothed the lapels of my crimson suit, gripped my briefcase tightly, and walked up the long, perfectly swept driveway toward the front entrance. The heavy ornate double doors were propped wide open to welcome the steady stream of arriving guests. A uniformed waiter stood near the entryway, offering flutes of expensive champagne from a silver tray. I ignored him, stepping smoothly past the threshold and into the grand foyer. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, rich food, and the intoxicating, arrogant energy of unearned wealth. I stood at the edge of the massive living room, quietly observing the scene before me. The room was packed with dozens of people, all dressed in their finest evening wear. In the absolute center of the room, standing beneath a massive glittering crystal chandelier, was the entire unholy trinity of my family. DeAndre and Chloe were holding court, surrounded by a tight circle of admiring church members. DeAndre was wearing a bright, flashy velvet jacket he had undoubtedly purchased in Milan, waving his hands animatedly as he recounted an obviously exaggerated story about their private boat tour in Italy. Chloe stood pressed tightly against his side, her arm draped over his shoulder, aggressively flashing her massive cartel-funded diamond ring at every woman who approached. Beatrice was gliding through the crowd like a queen, inspecting her subjects. She wore an elegant, sweeping evening gown, her new oversized pearls resting proudly on her chest. She was laughing loudly, accepting compliments from the neighbors, and subtly steering conversations toward her son's supposed financial brilliance. And there, standing near the towering stone fireplace, was Calvin. He held a glass of dark amber liquor, speaking in low, confident tones to a group of influential local politicians. He looked exactly like the powerful, untouchable pastor he pretended to be, completely hiding the frantic, terrifying panic that must have been consuming him since the cartel frontman threatened his life. I stood there for a long moment, simply watching them revel in their stolen glory. They were so incredibly proud of themselves. They were so utterly convinced that they had successfully outsmarted the quiet, unremarkable daughter they had discarded years ago. I took a deep breath, letting the cool, predatory calm wash over my entire body. It was exactly 8:20 p.m. The federal strike teams were moving into their final breach positions outside. The clock was ticking down the final seconds of their freedom. I adjusted my grip on my briefcase, lifted my chin, and stepped directly into the bright, crowded center of the living room, ready to deliver the final devastating blow. The music seemed to warp and fade into the background the moment I stepped fully into the bright light of the living room. The grand entrance was not something I had to force. It happened naturally as the sheer, undeniable energy of my presence collided with the fabricated, fragile reality my family had constructed. The guests standing nearest to the heavy double doors stopped talking mid-sentence. Their eyes widened, taking in the visual shock of my appearance. I was not wearing the sensible, muted colors they were accustomed to seeing me in. I was not the quiet, invisible daughter who usually blended into the background while my brother demanded the spotlight. I was wearing a razor-sharp, custom-tailored crimson designer suit that projected an aura of absolute terrifying authority. The rich red fabric caught the light from the massive crystal chandelier overhead, making me look like a walking, breathing warning sign. My pristine black stilettos clicked against the polished hardwood floor with a slow, deliberate rhythm that commanded the attention of every single person in the room. The welcome home gala my mother had organized was a grotesque, desperate caricature of European royalty filtered through the lens of suburban delusion. Beatrice had transformed their standard living room into a tacky, over-the-top spectacle designed to mask the terrifying reality of the cartel threat breathing down my father's neck. A massive, melting ice sculpture shaped like the Eiffel Tower sat in the center of the dining table, dripping water onto expensive silk tablecloths. Hired caterers in crisp white uniforms circulated through the crowd, passing out miniature beef Wellingtons and cheap caviar on silver platters. The air was thick with the suffocating scent of competing designer perfumes, heavy cologne, and the distinct, acrid smoke of an indoor cigar. It was a loud, desperate attempt to project a false image of limitless wealth to their congregation, their extended family, and most importantly, to themselves. In the absolute center of this ridiculous circus stood DeAndre. My 29-year-old brother was putting on the performance of a lifetime. He was wearing a highly tailored, aggressively patterned silk jacket that he had undoubtedly purchased during his fraudulent spending spree in Milan. He was casually puffing on a thick imported Cuban cigar right in the middle of the living room, completely ignoring my mother's usual strict rules about smoking indoors. He was surrounded by a captive audience of senior church deacons and impressionable younger cousins, acting as though he were a seasoned self-made millionaire dispensing invaluable life advice. I watched him gesture grandly with his cigar, completely intoxicated by his own fabricated success. He was telling them a highly exaggerated story about renting a private yacht in the south of France, bragging about how the European lifestyle was the only acceptable standard for a man of his newly acquired status. He was completely oblivious to the fact that the money funding his arrogant display belonged to a violent criminal syndicate and was currently being tracked by the federal government. Right beside him, feeding off the exact same delusional energy, was his fiancée, Chloe. She had abandoned any pretense of subtle elegance. Chloe was literally wearing a sparkling rhinestone tiara on her head, completely unironic in her belief that she was the new royalty of the family. She was holding court with a group of older churchwomen aggressively thrusting a limited edition, brightly colored designer handbag into their faces. I could hear her shrill voice cutting through the ambient noise of the party. She was bragging about how she had personally cleared out the VIP section of a boutique in Paris, proudly detailing the exact exorbitant price tag of every single item she was wearing. She twirled her hand to ensure the massive, cartel-funded diamond engagement ring caught the light from every possible angle. The church elders smiled and nodded their faces, a mixture of polite awe and hidden jealousy, completely unaware that they were admiring the physical evidence of a massive federal racketeering conspiracy. The guests representing the toxic community that had always enabled my family's worst behaviors began to part like the Red Sea as I walked deeper into the room. The whispers started at the outer edges of the crowd and rippled inward, a wave of confusion and shock preceding my steps. They were accustomed to seeing me as the tired, overworked spinster daughter who managed empty houses for a living. They were not prepared for the radiant, powerful woman gliding through their ranks with the quiet, lethal grace of an apex predator. I did not look angry. I did not look bitter, resentful, or defeated. I looked absolutely radiant. A genuine, relaxed smile played on my lips because I was carrying the ultimate devastating truth in the structured leather briefcase gripped firmly in my left hand. I was glowing with this profound, serene knowledge of their impending, unavoidable doom. Beatrice was the very first member of the inner circle to spot my approach. My mother was standing near the fireplace holding a crystal flute of champagne and accepting compliments on her new, oversized pearls. I watched the exact millisecond her eyes locked onto my crimson suit. The practiced, elegant smile completely vanished from her face, replaced by a sudden violent flash of sheer panic. The champagne flute in her hand trembled visibly, splashing tiny drops of expensive alcohol onto her designer gown. Her mind clearly short-circuited, trying to process my appearance. She had spent the entire evening telling her guests that I was going through a selfish phase and hiding away in shame. She expected a broken, begging victim to show up at her door. She did not expect a conqueror. Beatrice took a frantic step forward, desperately wanting to intercept me, to quietly pull me by the arm and shove me out the back door before I could ruin her perfect, glittering illusion. But she was entirely paralyzed by the sheer, imposing confidence radiating from my every step. The crowd had already parted, creating a wide, unobstructed path leading directly to the center of the room. She could do nothing but stand there and watch her nightmare unfold in real time. Calvin noticed the sudden shift in the room's energy and turned away from his conversation with the local politicians. When his eyes landed on me, his reaction was entirely different from my mother's. The arrogant, self-righteous posture of the megachurch pastor evaporated in an instant. The heavy, suffocating terror of the cartel buyer's threat rushed back to the surface of his features. Sweat visibly beaded on his forehead, shining under the bright lights of the chandelier. His knuckles turned white as he gripped his glass of expensive bourbon. In his desperate, panicked mind, he likely assumed I had finally surrendered to his demands. He was foolishly hoping that I had brought the original authentic title documents to save his life from the violent men he had defrauded. He looked at my leather briefcase with a mixture of desperate hunger and profound relief, completely misinterpreting the weapon I was carrying as his ultimate salvation. He had no idea that the documents inside that briefcase were not his rescue, but his federal execution. DeAndre and Chloe remained blissfully ignorant for a few moments longer, too deeply absorbed in their own arrogant performance to notice the sudden heavy silence descending upon the living room. DeAndre took another long puff of his cigar, throwing his head back in a loud, obnoxious laugh. It was not until the senior deacon he was speaking to nervously stepped backward, his eyes fixed on my approaching figure, that my brother finally turned around. The cigar smoke froze in the air between us. DeAndre's fake millionaire persona shattered instantly. He looked at my designer suit, my flawless posture, and the cold, dead-eyed smile on my face. The realization that I was not a defeated, broken woman hit him with the force of a physical blow. Chloe stopped talking mid-sentence, her hand slowly lowering as she clutched her expensive Paris handbag against her chest like a shield. Her rhinestone tiara suddenly looked incredibly cheap and childish in the face of my absolute unbothered power. I reached the absolute center of the living room, stopping precisely where the light from the chandelier fell directly over me. I stood perfectly still, allowing the heavy, suffocating silence to stretch out and consume the remaining ambient noise of the party. The string quartet in the foyer, sensing the dramatic, dangerous shift in the atmosphere, slowly stopped playing their instruments one by one. The silence was deafening. Every single eye in the massive suburban house was fixed entirely on me. I slowly scanned the faces of my family. I looked at Beatrice trembling in her expensive gown. I looked at Calvin sweating profusely as he stared at my briefcase. I looked at DeAndre, the cigar burning uselessly in his hand. I looked at Chloe, her arrogant smirk replaced by confused terror. I let them sit in their anxiety, letting the psychological weight of my radiant, untroubled silence crush their false confidence into dust. I was in complete control of the narrative, the pacing, and the outcome. The clock in my mind ticked steadily forward. It was 8:25. The federal strike teams were waiting patiently in the dark outside, their hands resting on their tactical gear, waiting for the precise moment to breach the perimeter. The grand tacky illusion of their European success was rapidly deteriorating, peeling away, to reveal the terrified, pathetic criminals hiding underneath. I stood my ground, my posture relaxed, but completely unyielding. I did not need to raise my voice to command the room. I simply stood there, a vision in crimson, embodying the absolute unstoppable force of their impending consequences. The standoff had officially begun, and they were completely unarmed against the truth I was about to unleash. Calvin finally broke the suffocating silence that had descended upon the grand living room. He handed his half-empty glass of expensive bourbon to a passing catering waiter with a sharp, highly dismissive flick of his wrist. He stepped directly into my path, intentionally positioning his large, imposing frame between me and the rest of the bewildered guests. He puffed out his chest, desperately attempting to reassert his dominant pastoral authority in front of his wealthy congregation, the influential church elders, and the local politicians he had spent decades trying to impress. He plastered a wide, incredibly fake and strained smile across his sweating face, forcefully playing the role of the benevolent but stern patriarch dealing with a wayward, rebellious child. "Look who came crawling back!" Calvin boomed, his deep voice intentionally projecting to reach every single corner of the expansive, high-ceilinged room. The prodigal daughter returns to the fold just in time to witness true blessings. I hope you are here to apologize for your recent disrespectful behavior, and more importantly, to hand over those original documents we discussed over the phone. I did not hand him the leather briefcase. I did not flinch, and I certainly did not offer the subservient apology he was desperately trying to extract from me to save face in front of his peers. I simply looked at him, conducting a rapid, highly forensic analysis of his physical and psychological state. The flawless facade he had maintained for his entire adult life was crumbling right before my very eyes. The man standing in front of me was no longer a powerful, untouchable religious leader. He was a terrified, cornered animal operating on borrowed time. I could see the rapid, frantic, and uncontrolled pulsing of the carotid artery in his neck against his stiff white collar. I noticed the fine, uncontrollable tremor in his fingers, a clear physiological response to the massive surge of adrenaline currently coursing through his system. The dangerous cartel frontman had clearly terrified him to his absolute core. Calvin was desperately trying to use the heavy social pressure of this crowded room to force me into immediate compliance. He genuinely believed that if he commanded me in front of his most important church deacons and wealthy neighbors, my deeply ingrained childhood conditioning would automatically kick in. He thought I would meekly bow my head and hand over the paperwork that would magically save his life and legitimize his massive real estate fraud. He was profoundly fatally mistaken. I remained perfectly still, my heavy silence acting as an uncompromising mirror reflecting his mounting terror straight back at him. Sensing the highly uncomfortable stretching tension between my father and me, Chloe decided to abruptly intervene. She pushed her way past DeAndre, determined to aggressively protect the glittering, fragile illusion of her newly acquired wealth. She strutted forward, the heavy imported silk of her custom designer gown swishing loudly against the polished hardwood floor. She held a fresh crystal glass of premium champagne in her right hand, taking a slow, theatrical sip before positioning herself directly beside Calvin. She looked me up and down, her eyes entirely devoid of any genuine confidence, filled instead with the frantic clawing need to establish her social superiority. "Let her be, Pastor Calvin," Chloe said, her voice dripping with toxic venom and artificial sickening pity. She raised her hand toward her face intentionally, ensuring the massive stolen diamond engagement ring caught the bright light of the crystal chandelier one more time. "Do not waste your valuable breath on her tonight. She is just bitter that she is pushing 35 and has absolutely nothing to show for her pathetic life. She works a miserable, dead-end job cleaning up after other people, and she is entirely alone in this world. Our European wedding was everything she will never ever have, and she simply cannot handle the fact that DeAndre is building a massive, generational legacy while her own life is a complete, undeniable failure." A low, highly uncomfortable collective murmur instantly rippled through the gathered crowd. Some of the older, more traditional churchwomen exchanged sharp, disapproving glances, clearly shocked by the sheer, unprovoked cruelty of Chloe's vicious attack. Others, the sycophants who actively fed on my family's toxic, dramatic energy, nodded in silent, eager agreement, waiting for my inevitable emotional breakdown. My internal monologue, however, remained entirely focused on the forensic data. As Chloe bragged about her European wedding, my mind automatically cross-referenced her custom silk gown to a specific illicit $12,000 wire transfer I had tracked from a boutique in Milan just 5 days prior. She was wearing federal evidence, and she was loudly bragging about it to a room full of potential witnesses. DeAndre finally stepped forward to join his bride, wrapping his arm securely around Chloe's waist in a pathetic show of unity. He puffed his chest out, emboldened by her aggressive, highly public defense of their stolen lifestyle. "You should just turn around and leave." Nia DeAndre added, his voice lacking the booming, practiced authority of our father but carrying the exact same suffocating, unearned arrogance. "You are completely ruining the high energy of our welcome home party. We just spent an entire month living like absolute royalty in Italy and France, dropping cash you will never see in your lifetime. We do not need your depressing broke energy bringing down the vibe of our celebration. Go back to your little, cheap apartment and let the real adults handle the family business from here on out." The entire massive living room held its collective breath. The catered staff froze in place, holding their silver trays of appetizers. The guests, my mother, my brother, and his arrogant bride, were all waiting for my reaction. They fully expected me to burst into tears of overwhelming humiliation. They expected me to start screaming defensively about my life choices, validating their vicious attacks by engaging in a loud, messy, and highly entertaining public argument. They desperately wanted me to perform the familiar role of the hysterical, jealous, and unhinged older sister so they could officially dismiss me and go back to celebrating their stolen, fraudulent wealth. They needed me to react so they could maintain the delusion that they were the ultimate victors. Instead, I did the one specific thing that absolutely terrifies a group of narcissists operating on borrowed time. I just smiled. It was a slow, deliberate, and incredibly predatory smile. It did not reach my eyes, which remained completely dead icy and locked directly onto Calvin's rapidly sweating face. I let the smile stretch across my features, an expression of pure, unadulterated menace and absolute control. I did not shift my weight. I did not grip the handle of my leather briefcase any tighter. I simply stood there in my razor-sharp crimson designer suit, radiating the absolute terrifying certainty of their impending, unavoidable destruction. I knew the precise coordinates of the tactical federal strike teams waiting silently in the dark outside. I knew the exact legal statutes they had violated. I possessed the undeniable power to end their freedom entirely, and that profound knowledge manifested as a terrifying, unnerving calmness. The psychological impact of my silent, unbothered smile was immediate and absolutely devastating to their fragile egos. The smug, victorious satisfaction completely drained from Chloe's face in an instant. She took a tiny, involuntary step backward, suddenly looking very small and incredibly foolish, wearing a rhinestone tiara in the middle of a suburban living room. DeAndre's fake millionaire bravado evaporated instantly into thin air. His eyes began darting nervously between my smiling face and the heavy, structured leather briefcase resting in my hand. He suddenly realized, perhaps for the very first time in his sheltered, enabled life, that I was not acting like a helpless victim begging for scraps of familial affection. I was acting exactly like an executioner who had already finalized the paperwork. Beatrice, standing off to the side, let out a sharp, fearful gasp, instinctively clutching her stolen South Sea pearls as if my smile alone could physically strike her. The wealthy congregation members began shifting uncomfortably, the thick, heavy tension in the room, mutating from dramatic entertainment into genuine, palpable dread. My silence was suffocating them, stripping away their carefully constructed armor piece by piece, exposing the raw, terrified criminals hiding underneath the designer clothing. Calvin simply could not handle the silence. The crushing, lethal pressure of the cartel threat breathing down his neck, combined with my absolute refusal to follow his mandated social script, finally snapped the last remaining frayed threads of his pastoral composure. The wholly benevolent mask of the megachurch leader completely shattered in front of his entire adoring congregation. His face twisted violently into a horrifying mask of sheer, unhinged panic and raw, desperate fury. His hands balled into tight, shaking fists at his sides, the expensive bourbon splashing carelessly onto the expensive Persian rug beneath his feet. "Why are you smiling like a psychopath?" Calvin yelled, his voice cracking violently, completely losing its deep, resonant, and controlled timbre. The severe, life-threatening anxiety from the shady cartel buyer was now violently bleeding right through his carefully maintained religious facade. He took an aggressive step toward me, spit flying from his lips as he lost all remaining control of his emotions. "Stop standing there looking at me like that and give me the damn documents right now. We do not have time for your childish, vindictive games, Naya. Hand over the paperwork before you destroy everything I have built for this family. You owe us this. Give me the deed." The echo of his desperate screaming demand bounced off the high vaulted ceilings of the grand living room, hanging in the suffocating air like a physical weight. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I did not raise my voice to match his frantic, unhinged pitch. The contrast between my father's red-faced, sweating panic and my absolute, statuesque composure was the most terrifying answer I could possibly give him. I slowly lifted my left hand and placed the structured leather briefcase squarely onto the edge of the nearest catering table, right next to the massive melting ice sculpture of the Eiffel Tower. The metallic, sharp click of the briefcase lock snapping open sounded like the cocking of a loaded weapon in the dead silent room. Every single pair of eyes in the massive suburban house was fixed entirely on my hands. Calvin leaned forward, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with a pathetic, desperate hunger. He genuinely believed, right up until the very last possible second, that I was reaching inside to hand him his salvation. He thought I was retrieving the original title documents that would magically appease the violent cartel buyer and make his massive real estate fraud legally binding. Instead, I reached inside the dark velvet lining of the briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy, meticulously organized file. It was a massive federal dossier bound tightly in thick manila folders. Emblazoned directly across the front cover in aggressive, unmistakable red ink was the official, deeply intimidating seal of the Department of Justice and the United States Marshals Service. I lifted the heavy dossier and dropped it flat onto the center of the catering table. The sheer weight of the file hit the table with a loud, authoritative thud. The impact forcefully knocked over an ornate silver tray stacked high with expensive, delicate hors d'oeuvres. Tiny, pristine caviar blinis and perfectly toasted truffle crostini scattered violently across the immaculate silk tablecloth and tumbled onto the expensive Persian rug below. Not a single person in the room moved to clean up the ruined food. The catering staff stood completely frozen against the walls. The church elders held their collective breath. All attention was entirely consumed by the heavy, red-stamped federal document resting ominously in front of me. "I am calm, Dad, because the mansion you sold wasn't mine," I stated, my voice projecting clearly and effortlessly, slicing through the heavy, stagnant air of the living room with surgical precision. The entire room went absolutely terrifyingly dead silent. The kind of silence that rings in your ears. The kind of silence that precedes a massive catastrophic explosion. I could literally see the cogs turning in my father's panicked brain, frantically trying to process a statement that completely defied his narrow, greedy understanding of the world. Beatrice let out a short, high-pitched gasp, instinctively taking a stumbling step backward. Chloe's jaw dropped entirely open, her rhinestone tiara suddenly looking like a ridiculous childish toy in the face of grave adult consequences. DeAndre simply stared at the red stamp on the dossier, his eyes wide, his breathing completely arrested. I did not stay rooted to my spot. I stepped away from the table, claiming absolute physical dominance over the entire room. I began to pace slowly, my black designer stilettos clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor, a slow, methodical drumbeat of their impending doom. "I do not own that house." I continued, making sure my voice reached the very back of the crowded room, addressing not just my terrified family, but the wealthy congregation members and local politicians who had enabled their toxic facade for decades. I am a forensic asset liquidator. I was directly contracted by the federal government to inventory and manage that property. That $6 million estate in Buckhead was raided and seized by the Drug Enforcement Administration exactly 3 months ago from a major, highly violent drug lord. It is the absolute, unquestionable legal property of the United States federal government. A collective, horrified murmur ripped through the crowd of well-dressed guests. Several prominent church deacons visibly took physical steps away from Calvin, instinctively trying to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of my revelation. The words Drug Enforcement Administration and United States federal government hung over my family like a heavy executioner's blade. The sheer magnitude of their profound stupidity was finally crashing down upon them, obliterating their arrogant delusions in a matter of seconds. Calvin's knees actually buckled. He reached out blindly, grabbing the edge of the catering table to keep himself from collapsing onto the ruined caviar scattered on the floor. His mouth opened and closed silently, struggling to draw oxygen into his panicked lungs. He looked at the red-stamped dossier, then back at me, the terrifying reality of his situation finally penetrating his thick, self-righteous skull. "You did not outsmart your daughter," I said, turning to face him directly, stopping my slow pace to deliver the absolute crushing finality of my investigation. I raised my right hand, extending my index finger with cold, clinical precision. I broke down their exact crimes, ticking them off my perfectly manicured fingers one by one. "First, you did not steal from me. You committed title fraud directly against the federal government," I stated, my voice ringing out like a judge delivering a mandatory sentence. "You knowingly bypassed restricted federal zoning laws to illegally transfer the ownership of a seized government asset." I extended my second finger, locking eyes with Beatrice, who was currently trembling so violently that her stolen pearls rattled against her collarbone. "Second, you forged a federal notary seal. You actively engaged Uncle Tyrone to backdate official state logs and replicate a governmental seal to facilitate a massive real estate heist. Uncle Tyrone is currently sitting in a windowless interrogation room downtown, singing like a bird and handing the feds every single text message and phone call you made to him." Beatrice let out a loud, wretched sob, burying her face in her hands. DeAndre began aggressively shaking his head back and forth, backing away from Chloe as if trying to physically escape the words coming out of my mouth. But I was nowhere near finished. I extended my third finger, turning my icy gaze back to the patriarch of the family. Third, and this is the most critical piece of your massive failure, I said, my voice dropping into a lethal, deadly, serious register. The man you sold it to. That angry, aggressive man who kicked down your office doors and threatened your life. He is not a standard real estate investor. He is a high-level cartel launderer who has been under active federal surveillance for over a year. He uses commercial acquisitions to wash dirty cartel money through the local housing market. Calvin let out a strangled, pathetic whimper. He clutched his chest, his knuckles turning pure white. And finally, I extended my fourth finger, pivoting to face DeAndre and Chloe, who were currently frozen in a state of absolute paralyzing terror. That $1.5 million you took was marked illicit drug money. I took a step toward my brother, refusing to let him look away from me. You bragged about securing the family legacy. You posted videos on rented yachts. You threw thousands of dollars onto nightclub tables in Paris. You bought designer suits in Milan and sparkling jewelry in France. Every single dollar you swiped, every single wire transfer you initiated, every ATM withdrawal you made was actively tracked, mapped, and logged by the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. You have spent the last 14 days willingly and enthusiastically laundering cartel funds across international borders. The sheer silence in the room was absolute, profound, and utterly devastating. The guests were completely paralyzed, trapped as unwilling witnesses to the total, unmitigated destruction of the most prominent family in their suburban community. The extravagant welcome home gala had instantly transformed into a federal crime scene. The melting ice sculpture continued to drip onto the table, a pathetic, ticking clock counting down the final moments of their freedom. You asked me why I was smiling like a psychopath. Dad, I said, bringing my hands down to my sides, standing perfectly straight in my immaculate crimson suit. I am smiling because you assumed I was a failure. You assumed my silence was weakness. You assumed you could use my entire life as collateral for a European vacation and a tasteless wedding. But while you were drinking vintage champagne and bragging to your congregation, I was sitting in a federal boardroom with the United States Marshals, building a bulletproof, watertight racketeer-influenced and corrupt organization's case against my own blood. I looked at the four of them taking in their ruined designer clothes, their pale, terrified faces, and their completely shattered egos. The arrogant illusion of their superiority had been violently ripped away, leaving nothing but four greedy, pathetic criminals staring down the barrel of a multi-decade federal prison sentence. You wanted to act like royalty, I whispered, my voice carrying clearly through the deadly quiet room. But you just bought yourselves front row seats to a federal indictment. I reached over to the dossier resting on the catering table and casually flipped open the heavy cover. Glossy, high-resolution surveillance photographs spilled out across the white silk tablecloth, layering themselves over the crushed caviar and spilled champagne. I made sure they were facing outward so the church elders and local politicians standing in the front row of the crowd could clearly see them. There were photos of Calvin aggressively prying open my locked filing cabinet with a screwdriver. There were crystal-clear, undeniable images of DeAndre and Chloe rummaging through my private workspace, stealing federal property directly off my desk. There were complex, color-coded financial flowcharts tracing the exact routing numbers from the cartel frontman's illicit shell company straight into DeAndre's supposedly secure offshore accounts. The visual evidence was absolutely staggering. A prominent local judge who had been invited to the gala as a guest of honor took one look at the federal seal on the documents and immediately turned on his heel power, walking toward the front door to escape the radioactive fallout. Several other high-profile guests immediately followed suit, murmuring in panicked, hushed tones, desperately trying to evacuate the premises before their own reputations were stained by association. But my family could not leave. They were entirely rooted to the floor, anchored by the massive, crushing weight of their own extreme hubris. Chloe was hyperventilating, her chest heaving as she stared at the high-resolution photograph of herself stealing the gold pen from my desk. The reality that she was not a glamorous high society bride, but rather a documented federal thief caught perfectly on camera, was causing her brain to completely short-circuit. She looked at her massive diamond engagement ring, the very symbol of her supposed triumph over me, and suddenly realized it was nothing more than a highly visible, incredibly expensive piece of federal evidence. DeAndre fell to his knees right there in the middle of the extravagant living room. The golden child, the prince of the family who had spent his entire life being enabled and protected by our parents, was finally facing a consequence that Calvin could not preach, bribe, or manipulate his way out of. He stared blankly at the wet carpet, the expensive, unlit Cuban cigar dropping from his trembling fingers and rolling away into the shadows. I stood above them, an immovable pillar of justice in a sea of shattered illusions. I had successfully executed the ultimate undeniable payoff. I had not screamed. I had not begged for their love or their approval. I had simply stepped back, gathered the hard forensic data, and allowed their own insatiable toxic greed to meticulously build the very cage that would trap them forever. The trap was now fully sprung. The execution was completely flawless, and the final beautiful consequences were entirely out of my hands. The absolute finality of my words struck the room with the force of a physical shockwave. I watched the last remaining traces of color drain completely from Calvin's face. His skin turned a sickly ashen gray, a stark and terrifying contrast to the perfectly tailored dark wool of his expensive suit. He staggered backward, his highly polished dress shoes slipping slightly on the slick, hardwood floor. The arrogant, untouchable pastor who had spent decades dictating the moral superiority of his entire congregation was suddenly reduced to a hyperventilating, terrified old man. He clutched at his chest, his mouth opening and closing as he desperately gasped for oxygen that his panic-stricken lungs simply refused to process. Beside him, Beatrice seemed entirely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the disaster. She stood frozen like a fragile porcelain doll, her eyes locked in absolute horror on the federal dossier resting on the catering table. The fingers of her right hand slowly uncurled, losing all their strength. The delicate crystal wineglass she had been holding slipped from her grasp. It fell through the air in agonizing slow motion, crashing violently onto the immaculate floor. The sharp, explosive sound of shattering crystal echoed like gunfire through the deadly, silent living room. Expensive red wine splashed aggressively across the polished wood and soaked deep into the intricate fibers of her custom Persian rug, looking exactly like fresh blood. Beatrice did not even flinch at the sound. She simply stared down at the broken shards of glass, her hands trembling violently as she instinctively reached up to clutch the stolen South Sea pearls tightly against her throat. Those heavy, flawless pearls no longer looked like a status symbol. They looked exactly like a glamorous, heavily documented federal noose tightening around her neck. The reality of the situation was actively devastating DeAndre in an entirely different manner. My golden child brother, the man who had just spent the last hour aggressively parading around the room, acting like a self-made European billionaire, began to physically unravel. He stumbled backward, his hands desperately grabbing at the edges of the catering table to keep himself upright. His breathing became incredibly erratic, shallow, and ragged. He bent over at the waist, clutching his stomach as a violent wave of genuine visceral nausea ripped right through his core. He gagged loudly, stumbling away from the crowd and collapsing against the stone fireplace. The bright, ostentatious silk jacket he had purchased with illicit cartel cash now clung to his rapidly sweating back. He looked completely pathetic, a fraudulent little boy who had played a dangerous game of pretend and was now facing the terrifying, inescapable consequences of adult reality. As the sheer crushing weight of the impending federal racketeer-influenced and corrupt organization's indictment fully settled over the room, the fragile toxic alliance between DeAndre and Chloe instantly disintegrated. There is absolutely no loyalty among thieves when the federal government arrives to collect its due. Chloe stood entirely rigid for a few agonizing seconds, her eyes darting frantically between the high-resolution surveillance photos scattered across the table and the miserable gagging figure of her fiancé huddled by the fireplace. The glamorous illusion of her new wealthy lifestyle was evaporating right before her eyes, rapidly replaced by the terrifying, highly realistic vision of a concrete federal prison cell. The instinct for self-preservation violently overrode any remaining shred of affection she held for my brother. Chloe spun around, her expensive designer heels snapping sharply against the floor as she turned her entire body toward DeAndre. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom.
He made me do it!
Chloe started screaming, her voice a shrill, piercing shriek that completely shattered the remaining quiet of the stunned living room. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger aggressively at DeAndre, desperately trying to construct a defense narrative in front of the dozens of potential witnesses standing around them. It was his idea. I didn't know it was a federal property. I thought it was just a regular house. He told me his sister gave him permission to sell it. DeAndre looked up at her, his eyes wide with profound betrayal and shock. Chloe, stop, he pleaded, his voice weak and raspy as he struggled to catch his breath. You were there. You told me to search the desk. We are in this together. We are not in anything together, you absolute idiot! Chloe shrieked, taking a threatening step toward him. You lied to me. You told me you were building a family legacy. You dragged me into a federal crime syndicate. I am not going to federal prison because you are too stupid to know the difference between a real estate investment and a drug cartel seizure. She was hyperventilating now, her chest heaving with sheer panic. She looked down at her left hand, her eyes fixing on the massive, flawless diamond engagement ring that had been the absolute centerpiece of her arrogant pride just minutes earlier. Suddenly, the ring was no longer a beautiful symbol of her elevated social status. It was a highly radioactive piece of evidence, a direct, undeniable link to the illicit cartel funds they had recklessly laundered across Europe. With a frantic, disgusted cry, Chloe grabbed the ring with her right hand and began aggressively yanking it over her knuckle. Her fingers were swollen from the humidity and the panic making the metal band stick stubbornly to her skin. She pulled harder, scraping her own skin in her absolute desperation to detach herself from the crime. The ring finally popped off her finger. She reared back and forcefully threw the heavy piece of jewelry directly at DeAndre's face. The platinum band struck him sharply on the cheekbone before bouncing off and clattering loudly onto the stone hearth of the fireplace. I am done with you! Chloe screamed, her voice cracking, as tears of pure terror finally began streaming down her heavily contoured face. I am calling my own lawyer. You and your entire toxic family can rot in a federal cell for all I care. The explosive, highly public dissolution of his son's engagement was the final devastating blow that completely broke my father's fragile grip on reality. The towering, authoritative megachurch pastor entirely vanished, leaving behind nothing but a desperate, cornered fraud. Calvin looked around the room, his eyes wide and frantic, searching the faces of his wealthy congregation members and influential political friends for any sign of support or intervention. But the crowd was completely silent, watching his destruction with a mixture of sheer horror and morbid fascination. No one stepped forward to help him. No one offered a prayer of deliverance. They were actively distancing themselves from his radioactive presence, realizing that his social capital was utterly worthless in the face of a federal indictment. Calvin turned his desperate, bloodshot eyes back to me. His legs, already trembling violently under the weight of his mounting terror, finally gave way completely. Calvin fell heavily to his knees right there in the middle of his extravagant, tacky welcome home gala. The sharp thud of his knees hitting the hardwood floor echoed loudly through the room. He did not care about his pride anymore. He did not care about his ruined, tailored suit or the fact that his entire congregation was watching their spiritual leader grovel on the ground like a pathetic beggar. He scrambled forward on his hands and knees, crawling across the damp, wine-soaked carpet until he reached the space directly in front of me. He reached out with shaking, sweaty hands and aggressively grabbed the sharp, tailored hem of my crimson designer pants. His grip was incredibly tight, born of absolute life-threatening desperation. He looked up at me, his face streaked with sweat and tears, completely shedding every single ounce of the proud, self-righteous pastor persona he had worn like armor for his entire life. "Nia, please!" Calvin begged, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched whine that sounded entirely foreign coming from his chest. "You have to fix this. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. You work for them. You can make this go away. We are your family. Please, I am begging you. Do not let them take me away. Tell the cartel we will get the money back. Tell the marshals. It was a clerical error. You can fix this." He was openly sobbing now, his tears soaking into the fabric of my trousers as he desperately clung to my legs. Beatrice had completely collapsed onto a nearby sofa, burying her face in a decorative pillow as she wailed uncontrollably, unable to bear the sight of her husband crawling on the floor. The great, powerful patriarch of our family was reduced to a sniveling, begging mess, completely shattered by the absolute reality of the consequences he had brought upon himself. I stood perfectly still, allowing Calvin to cling to my hem as he wept and begged for a salvation he absolutely did not deserve. I did not step back in disgust. I did not kick his hands away. I simply stood there, a towering pillar of absolute uncompromising justice, and looked down at the man who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small, insignificant, and utterly worthless. I conducted a rapid, final assessment of my internal emotional state. For 32 years, this man had demanded my respect while offering me nothing but his profound disappointment. He had belittled my career, dismissed my achievements, and ultimately attempted to steal my supposed livelihood to fund a luxurious vacation for his golden child. He had confidently told me that I was a failure because I did not fit into his narrow, misogynistic view of what a woman should be. Now he was kneeling in a puddle of spilled wine, and his own tears begging the daughter he had consistently marginalized to save him from a federal prison sentence. I looked down at him, my expression completely locked into a mask of absolute zero empathy. My eyes were cold, dark, and utterly devoid of any familial warmth or forgiveness. The icy calm that had carried me through the entire evening solidified into a permanent, unbreakable shield of steel. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for him. I felt nothing but the profound, deeply satisfying clarity of a flawlessly executed operation. I slowly reached down and firmly pried his shaking, sweaty fingers off the pristine fabric of my trousers. I stood up perfectly straight, smoothing the crimson material with slow, deliberate precision. I looked down into his terrified, desperate eyes, making sure my voice carried clearly and effortlessly across the dead, silent, horrified room, so every single guest could hear my final, devastating judgment. "You told me to be proud. I funded the family's legacy." I stated, my voice sharp, cold, and echoing with absolute terrifying finality. "I am. You're all going to be federally indicted as a family. A true bonding experience." The silence following my final declaration was abruptly shattered not by a response from my father, but by a sudden blinding explosion of light. Intense strobing flashes of brilliant red and piercing blue violently washed over the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the suburban living room. The synchronized flashing cast long, erratic shadows across the terrified faces of the congregation members and the ruined catering spread. The distant approaching wail of sirens morphed into an overwhelming, deafening roar that seemed to shake the very foundation of the house. Before anyone in the room could even process the flashing lights or formulate a single cohesive thought, the heavy rhythmic thud of tactical boots echoed loudly on the concrete front porch. The sound was military precise and entirely unmistakable. The heavy oak front doors, which had been propped open to welcome the affluent guests to this fraudulent gala, were violently shoved entirely open. A highly coordinated team of United States Marshals and FBI agents, fully clad in dark tactical gear, heavy Kevlar vests, and armed with tactical rifles, flooded into the grand foyer like an unstoppable dark tidal wave. At that exact same fraction of a second, a massive crash echoed from the rear of the estate. The heavy glass patio doors leading to the lavish backyard pool were completely shattered, raining sharp fragments of safety glass across the outdoor decking. A secondary breach team of heavily armed agents stormed into the house from the rear, effectively executing a flawless, synchronized pincer movement that completely locked down all possible escape routes. The operation was executed with a ruthless clinical efficiency that left absolutely zero room for negotiation or resistance. Federal agent search warrant. "Nobody move," a booming, mechanically amplified voice ordered through a bullhorn slicing straight through the rising panic of the crowd. "Keep your hands visible and step away from the primary targets." The carefully curated, wealthy guests of my parents' extravagant welcome home party erupted into sheer, unadulterated chaos. Women in expensive evening gowns shrieked and scrambled backward, desperately pushing against one another to distance themselves from the center of the room. Men who had just been smoking expensive cigars and discussing local politics dropped their drinks and raised their hands high into the air, terrified of making any sudden movements that might provoke the heavily armed strike team. The string quartet musicians huddled together behind their instruments, their eyes wide with sheer terror. Two burly FBI agents marched straight past the cowering guests, making a direct line for Calvin. My father was still kneeling on the wine-soaked carpet, his hands trembling violently. "Stand up and put your hands behind your back," the lead agent barked aggressively, hauling Calvin to his feet by the collar of his ruined designer suit. Calvin offered absolutely no physical resistance. His body had gone entirely limp, hollowed out by the crushing reality of his situation. Thick, heavy plastic zip ties were secured tightly around his wrists, biting deeply into his skin. "You have the right to remain silent," the agent recited loudly, ensuring every person in the room heard the words. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Over by the stone fireplace, DeAndre let out a pathetic, high-pitched wail as two United States Marshals flanked him. He dropped heavily onto his stomach, burying his face in the carpet, crying uncontrollably for his mother. "Please, I did not know." DeAndre sobbed hysterically as the agents grabbed his arms and forcefully yanked them behind his back. "I thought it was her house. I am just a kid." "You cannot take me." The agents ignored his pathetic, blubbering pleas, securing his wrists with thick plastic restraints. Chloe, who had been aggressively backing toward the kitchen in a desperate, futile attempt to blend in with the catering staff, was swiftly intercepted by a female FBI agent. Chloe fought back, thrashing her shoulders and screaming at the top of her lungs. "Let go of me. I am a victim here. He lied to me. I do not have anything to do with this cartel money. Check his accounts, not mine." I gave the ring back. The agent simply shoved Chloe flat against the marble kitchen island, neutralizing her frantic thrashing and securing her wrists with practiced, effortless efficiency. Suddenly, a loud, chaotic commotion erupted from the backyard garden. Through the shattered rear patio doors, I watched the highly entertaining capture of the final conspirator. Uncle Tyrone, the crooked street notary who had facilitated this entire federal nightmare, had apparently tried to use the distraction of the front breach to execute a stealthy escape. He had sprinted out the back door, desperately trying to vault over the tall manicured hedges separating the property from the golf course behind it. He did not make it. Two massive tactical agents tackled Tyrone mid-leap. The sheer force of the takedown sent all three men crashing violently into Beatrice's prized thorny rose bushes. Tyrone shrieked in pain as the heavy thorns tore through his cheap suit and scratched his face. The agents dragged him out of the foliage covered in dirt and bleeding from a dozen superficial scratches, slapping thick zip ties onto his wrists while firmly reading him his Miranda rights. Beatrice had remained frozen on the sofa, her hands clamped tightly over her ears, her eyes squeezed shut, as if she could simply wish the federal raid away by refusing to look at it. Two agents approached her, their expressions hard and uncompromising. "Beatrice Anderson, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud and making false statements to federal authorities," an agent stated clearly, grabbing her by the arm and forcing her to stand. The moment the plastic zip ties locked around her wrists, Beatrice snapped back to reality. She began to thrash violently, her eyes darting frantically toward the front door. The agents began the methodical, humiliating process of marching the four primary targets out of the house. The scene unfolding on the front lawn was a vision of absolute biblical destruction for a family that worshipped social status above all else. The massive fleet of federal vehicles had completely blocked the street. Bright strobing emergency lights illuminated the entire affluent suburban neighborhood. The commotion had drawn out every single wealthy neighbor. People were standing on their pristine lawns wearing their expensive silk pajamas and luxury bathrobes, openly staring at the spectacle. The guests from the party were being systematically ushered out of the house, forced to walk past the flashing police cruisers. These were the church elders, the influential politicians, and the wealthy socialites my parents had spent decades aggressively courting and desperately trying to impress. Now these same people were standing on the sidewalk, pulling out their smartphones and hitting record. As Calvin was marched down his own grand driveway, his head was bowed low in utter, profound disgrace. The megachurch pastor who had confidently preached about the divine rewards of his own righteousness just days earlier was now being paraded in front of his flock as an ordinary, pathetic criminal. The heavy gold Rolex on his wrist looked incredibly grotesque next to the thick plastic zip ties binding his hands. DeAndre was physically dragged out behind him, his vibrant, expensive European silk shirt torn and stained with sweat. He was crying loudly, a continuous embarrassing stream of snot and tears covering his face. The golden child, the supposed builder of the family legacy, was publicly reduced to a sniveling begging fraud. Chloe followed her mascara completely ruined, furiously screaming obscenities at DeAndre and anyone else who would listen, actively trying to kick her future husband in the shins as the agents forcefully separated them into different transport vans. But the absolute pinnacle of the public humiliation belonged to Beatrice. As the agents escorted her down the front steps, the bright flashing lights of the neighborhood smartphones caught her eye. The women she played tennis with, the church gossips she had aggressively lorded over the country club, rivals she had endlessly tried to outshine. They were all standing there, filming every single agonizing second of her downfall. Beatrice completely broke. She dug her designer heels into the concrete driveway, refusing to walk any further. "Please," she wailed, her voice a ragged, desperate screech that echoed loudly down the quiet suburban street. "Stop recording. Please put your phones away. This is a misunderstanding. We are good Christians. We are a good family. Do not put this on the internet." Her desperate pleading screams only encouraged the crowd. Camera flashes went off in rapid succession, capturing the pathetic image of Beatrice Anderson dripping in stolen South Sea pearls and a custom evening gown, begging for her social life while securely fastened in federal handcuffs. The agents ignored her frantic protests, grabbing her firmly by the shoulders and shoving her roughly into the back of a dark, armored federal transport vehicle. The heavy metal doors slammed shut, instantly cutting off her wailing cries and sealing her fate in absolute pitch-black darkness. I remained standing quietly on the front porch, leaning casually against a thick stone pillar. I watched the entire chaotic operation unfold with the cold, detached professionalism of an auditor reviewing a finalized spreadsheet. I did not feel a single twinge of guilt. I did not feel a sudden, unexpected rush of familial sorrow. I felt nothing but the profound, deeply satisfying closure of a perfectly balanced ledger. The flashing red and blue lights painted my crimson designer suit in shifting dynamic patterns. I watched the tactical team secure the perimeter of the now empty, ruined house. The tacky melting ice sculpture in the living room was likely pooling onto the hardwood floor, a fitting end to the fragile temporary illusion they had sacrificed everything to build. A senior FBI agent holding a clipboard loaded with my highly encrypted, perfectly organized forensic files walked up the steps toward me. He looked at the chaos subsiding on the street, then turned his gaze to me with an expression of genuine, unmasked professional respect. "We have all the targets secured, Ms. Anderson," the agent stated, his voice calm and authoritative. "Your documentation was flawless. The digital trace on the offshore accounts matched your timeline perfectly, and the notary's confession is already corroborating your entire executive summary. We are locking down the cartel buyers' properties across the city as we speak. This is one of the cleanest takedowns we have executed this year." I nodded slowly, acknowledging his report without a trace of arrogance. It was simply the truth. I had given them a masterclass in forensic destruction. I looked out toward the dark, heavily armored federal vans as they began to roll slowly down the manicured suburban street, carrying the toxic, parasitic burdens of my past away into the unforgiving machinery of the federal justice system. The heavy armored doors of the federal transport vans slammed shut with a resounding metallic finality that echoed down the quiet, manicured streets of the affluent suburban neighborhood. The stark flashing red and blue lights illuminated the pristine lawns and the shocked pale faces of the wealthy congregation members who had gathered on the sidewalks. I remained standing on the wide front porch of my parents' now empty, silent house, leaning casually against the stone pillar. The cool night air felt incredibly refreshing after the stifling, oppressive heat of the living room confrontation. Special Agent Ramirez walked up the concrete steps toward me. His tactical vest was still secured tightly, and his radio crackled with low static reports from the perimeter units. He stopped a few feet away and removed his heavy tactical gloves. He extended his right hand toward me, his expression reflecting a profound, genuine professional respect that I rarely encountered outside of the agency. Ms. Anderson Ramirez said, his voice steady and appreciative as I reached out and shook his hand firmly. I have been working in the Financial Crimes Division for over 12 years. I have never seen a civilian operative hand us a corrupt state notary, a high-level cartel launderer, and 4 documented confessed fraudsters on an absolute silver platter. Your evidentiary documentation was flawless. The digital trace you established on those offshore accounts gave us the exact leverage we needed to execute the warrants tonight. You did incredible work. I nodded, slowly accepting his praise without any false modesty. It was simply the truth. I had executed my job with the cold, precise efficiency that the United States Marshals Service demanded. I just provided the data, Agent Ramirez. I replied, my voice completely steady and untroubled. They chose to commit the felonies. I simply made sure the federal government was watching when they did it. Ramirez offered a slight knowing smile before turning back toward the street. The convoy of dark, unmarked federal vehicles began to roll slowly away from the curb, carrying the toxic, parasitic burdens of my past, away into the unforgiving machinery of the federal justice system. I watched the taillights disappear around the corner, taking my father, my mother, my brother, and his arrogant fiancée straight into federal holding cells where they would remain without bail until their arraignment. The extravagant fake European lifestyle they had so desperately tried to project to the world was now entirely, irrevocably destroyed. I walked down the long driveway, the sharp click of my designer stilettos, the only sound breaking the heavy silence that had fallen over the neighborhood. The wealthy neighbors, the church elders, and the local politicians parted wordlessly as I approached my car. They looked at me with a profound mixture of awe and absolute terror, finally realizing that the quiet, unassuming daughter they had spent years looking down upon was actually the most dangerous, powerful person they had ever encountered. I bypassed the row of leased Mercedes and rented BMWs that my family's friends had parked along the street. I walked directly to my sleek custom matte black Porsche Panamera. The powerful engine roared to life with a deep, aggressive growl that perfectly matched my internal rhythm. I slipped into the driver's seat, the luxurious, hand-stitched leather wrapping around me like a well-earned embrace. I did not look back at the sprawling suburban house that had been the site of so much emotional abuse and manipulation. I shifted the car into gear and drove out of the gated community, leaving the ruins of their fraudulent empire far behind me. The drive back to my actual home in Midtown Atlanta was peaceful. The city skyline rose up before me, a glittering, vibrant testament to the real success and power I had built on my own terms. I pulled into the hyper-secure subterranean garage of my glass high-rise, the biometric scanners granting me access to the private elevator that would take me directly to my top-floor penthouse. As I stepped into my massive minimalist living room, the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the city. I walked over to the glass, looking down at the endless stream of headlights moving along the highways. The silence in my penthouse was not lonely or oppressive. It was deeply comforting. It was the absolute unbothered silence of true freedom. I poured myself a glass of expensive, legitimate champagne from my own collection, not to celebrate a stolen victory, but to toast the profound clarity of my new reality. I stood by the window, swirling the golden liquid, reflecting on the absolute absurdity of blood versus loyalty. My family had operated under a deeply flawed, incredibly dangerous assumption. They thought because I was quiet, I was weak. They thought because I did not flash my wealth or brag loudly about my accomplishments, I had absolutely nothing of value. They genuinely believed that because I chose not to participate in their toxic, exhausting performance of fake success, they were inherently superior to me. They let their unchecked greed and profound jealousy blind them to the reality of who I actually was. They sold me out for a luxury European vacation, a tacky wedding, and a few weeks of bragging rights on social media. And in exchange, they bought themselves a mandatory 15-year stay in a federal penitentiary. They had mistaken my silence for submission, completely failing to understand that sometimes silence is simply the sound of a predator patiently waiting for the trap to spring. They demanded a family legacy, and I ensured they received one that would be permanently recorded in the federal database. Have you ever had a family member mistake your silence for weakness? Have you ever had to sit back, gather your evidence, and watch a toxic relative build their own cage? How did you serve them? Their ultimate undeniable karma. Let me know your stories in the comments below. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel for more stories of absolute justice, and always remember, never ever steal from a woman who audits the underworld for a living.